All right, so we've talked calories in, calories out. We've talked about macronutrients. We've talked about um, the history of things and how we think that cholesterol causes heart attacks and how we went after LDL last week. We talked all about the different organizations and associations who write our policies and guidelines and all that stuff. Um, as always, the goal of what I'm trying to do is be completely diet agnostic and let people decide whatever diet they want to. I don't necessarily want people to be eating a certain way. I don't even care if people eat the way I do or not. You should eat the way that you want, that gives you the best health, that makes you sacrifice the least amount. Anyway, what we're going to be talking about today is basically biological. It's a system. It gets associated with a diet. And we're going to talk about why it's not one particular diet and why it is a system inside our body that we can use and activate at any time. Before we get into what we're going to talk about today, I just want to say, like, imagine if you were taught something, and for 10 years you're reinforced and taught this one thing, and you try to go out and teach it, and you give it to people, and time after time after time, people can't do it. They end up failing. They feel really bad about themselves, and it just never seems to work. And you start to think after a while, like, why is everybody so lazy? Why are people not doing a good job following the advice? I'm clearly, spelling this out for people and telling people what to do, and they're not doing it. And so people come to me and they think they want to lose weight. So, okay, well, let's give you several meals a day. Let's make sure you have good snacks. Let's do the meal prepping. Let's make sure you balance your whole grains during the day and make sure you get plenty of vegetables. And what would happen is people would be very motivated. They'd start doing it, and then they would get sick of the food, or they wouldn't have time to meal prep, or the food would be gross at the end of the week and they would throw it away. And you could just name any little way that people would end up failing and people would fail. In 2018, you guys will all remember back the place I used to work, which shall not be named.
Good. Two four-letter words.
Exactly. Two four-letter words. Weight loss contest. Remember the weight loss contest we had to do? 60-day challenge. Started as a 90-day challenge. They made tons of money when they did it. We would discount our services as trainers. So they switched it from doing 90-day challenge twice a year to do the 60-day challenge 4 times a year so that they could make more money. And as trainers, we're paid 100% commission. So we don't have like a baseline salary. If we don't sell stuff, we don't make any money. Simple as that. So part of these contests, we would have to go out and find people to sign up for this. We would get in trouble from our managers if we didn't sign up enough people to do these contests. And the problem was the percentage of people that would finish the contest would be about 15%. So if you had 100 people that signed up for the contest, at the end of the contest, on average, you'd have 15 people that would finish, like stand on the scale regardless of whether they did well or didn't do well. Like nobody would even do it, because if you recall, you'd get a big packet of information. It might have lists of foods that are quote unquote healthy foods, and all the different activities and workout guides you'd also get. But all these, again, food lists would come with tons of recipes that had lots of ingredients, and it was, you'd had like things on this list would be like rutabagas or arrowroot powder or buckwheat or amaranth grains. And it's like, yeah, you can go get those, but it's not really practical, and everybody would fail. Again, 15% of people would be compliant to that contest. And so for Bethany and I, it was one of the worst experiences, because you knew that another one was always coming up. You'd finish one and it would be done. Thank goodness, got it done, out of the way, had to find 15 new people. But then it's like, okay, now you have 1 month to find another 15 people to do this again. And if you did it once, you'd fail, so you wouldn't do it a second or a third or a fourth time. You already got all the information. You saw that it didn't work. Why would you pay for this thing and do it again? So we hated it.
So I got to leave. So I'm going to give my little experience on that.
Please.
Is Wade had already gotten in shape and then went to you for some stuff. And so we were at that gym. And I finally signed up for a 60-day. But then there were 2 trainers that he goes under. So I didn't know which one to do and everything. But I went to their opening on Saturday and did their little mini routine, and I was like, I'm out of shape. I'm really bad. I couldn't do anything, but I knew I needed to get my diet in check. And so I signed up for all these classes and then regretted it because I'm like, I can't do all this stuff in my life. I can't go to classes 5, 6 times a week and do this, but I felt bad. And so got rid of some of those. I don't do that. But the 60-day worked for me because I was committed to it.
Yeah.
I did that little bit of exercise that I had never done before. And they were mostly trying to sell the vitamins and the different shakes. But it worked because at home, they were already eating the way I needed to eat.
Yep.
And so it worked. But then, everything shut down and everything. And then I just gained all this weight, which has still not left. But most of it's the diet.
Yeah. Yeah. And thank you for sharing that. I think most of us can relate to that and knowing.
Because I felt so good while I was really active in doing it.
Yeah.
And go, wow, this fat is just coming right off.
Yep.
But it was also what I was really eating, which was avoiding the sugar, avoiding the carbohydrates. It was what really worked for me. But then on my own, it's hard to do it.
Yeah. No, I get it. And that would be the hard thing is like when we're recommending, for example, that people eat a ton of fruit, that there's a normal, quote unquote, healthy thing. What I would notice, not that, again, fruit is not bad. You eat it and you'd eat a lot of sugar and then people would be really hungry for other things. You'd eat a meal that had some apples, and that's fine. But 20 minutes later, you now want candy bars. You just got really hungry. And so we were used to people signing up for the main program and watching it fail and not being motivated to do it again. The idea of it's awesome. It's a really great idea. And if it could kickstart somebody on a healthy path and be helpful as far as movement, it's great. And so this is 2018. I do a consult with a guy. I just gotten certified as a nutrition coach the year before. This guy comes in. He's an employee. You guys would know him. And he was forced to do the contest. He didn't really even want to do the contest. He's telling me what he's eating. He says, waking up at 2 a.m. to eat cereal, for example. And I'm listening to the things he's eating. And I'm just like, okay, well, I knew about fats and proteins and how that would help somebody. I was eating a very mixed diet at the time. But I just said, look, you have hardly any protein in your diet. You're not really eating any fat. Maybe eat a little bit more of that and see if you become less hungry over time. And he came back to me in a few days and said, well, I've already lost a few pounds. What's this keto stuff? And so I said, well, that's cool. You shouldn't have lost the amount of weight. The amount of weight he told me in like 3 days was like 2 or 3 pounds. Like according to any personal training book I've ever gotten says you can't do that. That's too fast.
Yeah.
So he must have done something wrong or whatever. And he asked me about what this keto stuff was. And I said, that's cool that you lost all that weight, but I don't really know what keto stuff is. I'll get back to you. And that was pretty much the last day I ever listened to music in my car, and pretty much the last day that I didn't obsess about that question, where literally like my entire life has been centered around the question that he asked me that day. Like the podcast that I do, I spend thousands of dollars to put it out there. We have over 600 episodes now where I've interviewed doctors, researchers, professors, world experts in cancer and metabolism and nutrition and fitness and all of these different things. When I go to like in a week and a half, I'll be in San Diego on my own dime to attend a medical conference called the Symposium for Metabolic Health, where I'm going to be in San Diego in August, not at the beach. I will be in the hall of a hotel Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, missing my own business, so losing out on my clients and paying to be there to sit in a lecture hall essentially to hear talks about people. I do that several times a year. That's my vacation. That's what I do for like a vacation. So again, around this question has just completely like taken over my life and has made me very curious about it. So we're going to be talking today about not the keto diet. Again, we are going to be diet agnostic. I don't care about any diet that says it's keto or not keto. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a human state of ketosis. What happens in the body when the body's in ketosis? you can do that on many, many, many different diets. You could not change your diet and try fasting. You could be vegan, you could be vegetarian, you could be carnivore, you could be somewhere in the middle, and you could be in this state. It's a metabolic state. That's what we're going to be addressing today, and we're going to talk about that. Important to note, if you do try something like this and you try to purposely put yourself in what is essentially like a fat burning state, this can be a very, very, very powerful intervention. And so it's really important that you, if you have questions, if you notice symptoms of different things, something doesn't feel right, work with a professional. If you're on medications, definitely work with your doctor, because you might have to come off medications very, very quickly. High blood pressure, insulin, mental, any kind of medication that you're taking for mental health, you need to be very, very careful with, because you can fix some pretty serious stuff depending on the level that you want to go into this. So that's obviously a disclaimer. We're never offering any kind of medical information when we do this. But to start out, I want to show you the graph that's on the very top. This is called Fat and Carb Burn. The name of this lesson is called The Art of Burning Fat, and in parentheses, isn't that what you want? And on this picture, you see a graph of a person, and it says calories from carbohydrates, and there's a number 2,000 there. And then there's calories from fat, and there's a number that says 197,658,000. So this is an example of what somebody might be storing in the form of carbohydrate and or fat. The carbohydrate number of storage is based on your muscle mass. If you have more muscle, you have more of a storage space to put carbohydrates. So that number might be slightly higher. Just as an average, we say most males, that number is about 2,000 calories. For most females, we say it's about 1,500 calories. So a little bit less. The number of calories you have available from fat depends on your weight and your body fat percentage. If you extrapolate those two numbers, you'll have what's called your body fat mass, how much fat you have on the body. And if you do the math, 3,500 calories, and every gram of fat has 9 calories, you can know exactly what this number is for you. But suffice it to say that even if you are extremely lean, and don't have a lot of body fat, this number can be in the tens of thousands. If you are 500 pounds and morbidly obese, this number might be 600,000, 700,000. It can be very, very high. Okay, so this is the storage form of energy you have in the body. Those are your energy sources, carbohydrates and fat. Also important to say that the number that you see from the calories stored from carbohydrates is an upper limit, meaning once you hit the upper limit, you cannot go further into more storage. Once it's out, it's out. The fat number is based on your fat cells and how much you can fill them up. We all are born with different numbers of fat cells. Some people can get very, very big. Ironically, they can also be very healthy because the fat cells are keeping them healthy, because it's a space where you can continually store carbohydrates. So, Lad, we've talked about your leanness before and how it's a double-edged sword. Like, you will never be 600 pounds. Right. If you had a desire to be on those documentaries, I've got bad news for you. You're never going to make it on my 600-pound life. You're going to have to give up on that dream. I'm sorry. But the unfair thing to you is you might be very, what we call thin on the outside, fat on the inside, right, where you might have metabolic disease at a smaller size than most of us, because you probably don't have as many fat cells that other people do. So again, it's kind of a double-edged sword. At least when you're gaining fat, you're stuffing right, energy into that, and so it helps you in that sense. But the number of calories from fat can go way, way, way up. So here's the problem. If you only have that many calories of carbohydrates, this is a fact, you only have max, best case, 2,000 calories of carbohydrates. There are tissues in the body, your brain, fat cannot travel the blood-brain barrier. So your brain has to have glucose. Your red blood cells do not have mitochondria. They have to have glucose. Part of your pancreas, no choice, has to have glucose. So what happens if you went a day or 2 days without food, without consuming carbohydrates, when you can only store 2,000 calories of carbohydrates? How is it, first of all, why don't you die? Do you die? If you go 2 days without food, you should be dead. Why do you die?
No.
Why?
Well, because you're burning something somewhere.
your body's trying to keep you alive, so it will shut off other areas.
It-
Liver produces it.
So yes, you're always producing some amount of carbohydrate that you're taking from other substances. So yes, that's true. What's that?
Protein.
You can take apart protein and make carbohydrate. You can also burn fat and make a small amount of carbohydrate. That's called gluconeogenesis. We've talked about that before. Glucose, new, genesis, creation. But even so, like the amount of energy your brain needs, for example, is like 150 grams of carbohydrate worth in an entire day. So it's kind of a lot. So if your body needed to do that, the rate at which it would be breaking down protein to be able to do that, I mean, 150 grams in weight, I mean, that's getting half a pound a day. You'd be losing like a pound of muscle every few days if you were doing that. You basically eventually kind of waste away with cachexia when your body's just losing too much of its mass. So yes, we can make some, but the amount that we would need to fuel the brain and those other tissues, like I said, would be very, very high. That would be a problem. Again, brain can't run on fat. So the answer to that question is also that the body can burn fat, and when it does, it creates a substance called a ketone body, which is a water-soluble energy source, just like carbohydrate, that can be a fuel for the brain, and that can give the brain all the energy that it needs along with all those other tissues. So we're going to talk about two different energy systems, and
wait. So ketones cross the blood?
ketones very readily, without help, cross the blood-brain barrier, and
so the two that do are carbs and ketones.
Carbs and ketones. Yep, and it's, again, carbohydrate is not necessarily a macronutrient that we eat, but
Right.
we can burn fat as a byproduct of burning fat. We get ketones, which is a different kind of an energy source that different tissues in the body can use as fuel, and that is why we don't starve to death. That's why you could go without food for a week, 2 weeks. You might be hungry, but you're not going to die. It's been recorded. People have done medically supervised fasts for over a year. People that have lots of fat and had to lose weight, and they were, again, medically supervised, given water and electrolytes, but they didn't die. Like, you stay alive, and that's not eating any food for over a year. So quite incredible. These are the two energy systems in the body, and I want to take you through each of these so that you understand there is not a third energy system in the body. It's these two. Think of it as two halves of a coin, two hemispheres. This is all explained incredibly well by this book called Body Science by Dave Champion, PhD. He's become a really good friend of mine. He explains all of this stuff really quite well, so I'm going to be borrowing heavily from him when we talk about these things.
Is that written in a lay?
Yes, I would say it's written in a lay. I would be very comfortable giving this book to some of my clients.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. The first energy system that we're going to talk about is a word that it's mentioned in literature extremely rarely, but it's a word that basically Dave had to coin to write this book because he realized that this energy system is not described very well in the medical literature. And so he needed to create a word for it, essentially, and he calls it glucosis. Or this is what happens when the body runs on carbohydrates. When you ingest carbohydrates, what's the system? How does it work? How are you fueled? What happens? Glucosis is, and we'll also be talking about what we call the hepatic energy system, which means energy, obviously, and how you deliver your energy. Hepatic means the liver. So this is how you activate the liver to deliver energy around the body. Glucosis is the state that most people, if they're eating a standard American diet, are probably in this state a vast majority of the time. This is what happens when you consume carbohydrate. Again, this is not saying you should do this as a diet. This is not recommending a diet. This is just what happens biologically inside the body. When you consume carbohydrates, your body will start breaking down carbohydrates to their most simple form called monosaccharides. It's like glucose, essentially. There's a few others, but it's the most simple type of carbohydrate that you can have. Glucose is water soluble. So once it gets into the digestive system, it can start to get out of the digestive system and into the body and goes directly to the blood where it can accumulate in some way. All carbohydrates do this. So if you eat broccoli or if you eat candy bars, this happens. Obviously, carbohydrates come in different qualities and different amounts of things like sugar. So if you have a massive amount of sugar, like a candy bar, you'll have a massive amount of glucose in the end, and that gets into the blood quickly in a massive amount. If you have broccoli, that's a much lower amount, a lot more fiber and things that you can't even digest anyway, so it'll be a much smaller amount. So this happens, again, with every carbohydrate, but obviously the choice of carbohydrate that you make will be the amount that gets in, the quickness that it gets in, all those things that matter. What have we learned about excessive carbohydrates, glucose in particular, inside the blood? Remember from past lessons what happens when we have too much glucose in the blood? Eventually,
Yeah.
yes. Yes, eventually, yes. Exactly right.
Otherwise, it's still in the blood state until something happens.
Perfect, yes. When glucose gets into the blood, this is a metabolic emergency that has to be dealt with right now by the body. Glucose in the blood, you have a teaspoon. If you're healthy, you have about a teaspoon of sugar, glucose in your blood at any given time. So if you increase that, suddenly, that's an emergency that your body has to deal with right away. The way the body does this is it releases the hormone insulin. We had that whole lesson on insulin and insulin resistance. Insulin is a storage hormone that says too much blood sugar, too much blood glucose, let's get this out of here and put it away somewhere where it will go. Insulin is very good and very powerful at what it does, and insulin does a lot of things, but primarily as an anabolic or growing hormone, it makes you grow. It will do essentially two things. One is it will tell the cells to open up so that sugar can be pushed inside of the cells until the cells say, okay, we've got it, we've got too much anyway, we don't want this stuff anymore. The second thing that it will do is it will trigger the liver to generate energy from excessive glucose that can't find storage space. Okay? So the insulin, again, will tell cells to open up so that energy can be pushed in there. Once that limit is basically full, insulin will then tell the liver to take the glucose, convert it into a storage form that it can then deal with, which is called triglycerides. And triglycerides is the form of fat in the body that then goes to fat cells to be stored for longer term storage use. In that state, your body will experience a blood sugar rise, a blood sugar peak, a blood sugar decline, and a blood sugar kind of a bottom point. And when you're at that point, your blood sugar is then really, really low and too low. So if you've ever had a high amount of sugar and then feel pretty good for like 30 minutes, but then you might get a headache, or you might get shaky, or you might get very hungry, you might have a lot of cravings, that's when the blood sugar is now way too low, triggering more cravings for more carbohydrate that will then make the blood sugar go back up again and continue that kind of a pattern. Like I said, if you are an American eating the standard American diet, this is pretty much, I'm describing your life. Essentially, this is what state you're in pretty much most of the time. Any questions so far?
No, but I sure am having flashbacks to those sacrament table cleanups.
Totally. The white bread.
Yeah.
A lot of white bread. This is, again, the whole thing to say is like a lot of blood sugar is a medical emergency inside your body that has to be dealt with right now. Your body doesn't care about long-term consequences when there's a problem right now, right? If your house is burning down, you're not going to worry about if the paint is a little bit faded in the second bedroom, right? You're going to deal with, hopefully, the house burning down right then. You can get to the paint a little bit later. Same thing with your body. It doesn't care about chronic diseases like heart disease or diabetes or any of these other things that manifest for a long time. It has to deal with the emergency now. This is a system that it has created to deal with this system and deal with the blood sugar that is toxic inside. It is inflammatory. We've learned that about carbohydrate as we did the lesson again about insulin and insulin resistance. It can cause damage to the endothelium, which is the inner lining of blood vessels.
Does that inflammation show up in cytokines, or how?
Yeah, you definitely see a rise in cytokines and other inflammatory markers.
But is that a long-term development, or what's the acute inflammatory response?
The acute is that sugar is just, it's toxic in the blood. It can't.
So just sugar itself is toxic.
Sugar itself, the other things we talked about, like grains, which eventually convert to glucose and sugar. We think that the polyunsaturated oils, as they get in, can also be highly inflammatory and create chain reactions inside the body called free radical kind of chain reactions. So there's a lot of sources of inflammation. It can manifest in a lot of different ways. But again, it's an acute. This is an emergency. Let's deal with this now. This system, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years of our evolution, if we're just using common sense, and again, we know this, when you look at a land that has a temperate climate where we find human remains, people survived all year at times when there was not food available growing freely, when people would not have had a high amount of carbohydrate in their diet. They just would not have. You think about what you could have done to have high carbohydrates in the diet, and it's like, well, you could maybe save some tubers if you found some. Those would be probably limited. You'd have to know where they were and how to prepare them so they didn't kill you. You might get some fruit, but again, that's incredibly seasonal, and fruit that looks vastly different than what our fruit looks like today. You might be able to cultivate some grain, and that's how we got into agriculture, where we learned how to grow grasses like corn and wheat, and we could subsist on that, although with some health issues. Other than that, there just would not have been very much of the carbohydrate in the diet for us to use. So when this emergency system kicked on, it would do so incredibly rarely. It would help our bodies store fat, but it's not a system that we would run all the time. It's an emergency backup system, not designed to be run all the time, because it would not have, it could not have. We just were not in any kind of an environment where carbohydrates were just widely available. And I would challenge people even that say that, like, well, what about like around the rainforest? What about the Amazon? What about like tropical places where fruit grows a lot? I would say even there, like next time you're on vacation, walk around, look around and see if you find lots of fruit trees. Probably don't find that many, and they also might be very, very seasonal. It's just, it's tough. You're competing against other animals for things like fruits. You might be battling hives of bees if you wanted to get to some honey. That's probably a little painful to get stung a bunch of times. It's just, again, it's a food stuff that would be extremely rare. The system would not need to run very much. When it did, it would help us store fat that we could then use when the carbohydrates went away, and we could use our other system. That's the one hemisphere that's called glucosis, is what we're going to call it. Energy system number 2 is ketosis. This is what I would strongly contend, and others strongly contend. This is our normal, natural state. When carbohydrates are less present inside the body, we then need to find food from somewhere else, which would become the combination of fats and proteins. Again, if I'm looking around here by the lake, I can walk around. I walk around here every single day. I don't find lots of fruit. I don't find many vegetables unless people are trying to cultivate them. There's certain, grass grains really that people are growing around here. But I see ducks. I see fish. Those are combinations of proteins and fats. I could very easily subsist on ducks. They're here year round. You could grab one duck or figure out a way to trap a duck or whatever. Wade loves ducks, so that would make him a little bit sad, but you could probably live if you did that. Let's go with we'll go with gooses. We have some really mean geese around here. Yes. They're bigger anyway, so feed the whole family. Turkey.
Turkey goose.
Exactly. Like I when I go camping, I see people who do fishing in the Uintas, and like they're not working all that hard. And within 30 minutes, I see couples that have caught a lot of fish, and they just devise a pretty simple method and like catch some fish, and they kind of sit around and talk, and it's just not that hard. You know what I mean? Also to say that, as we've talked about in the past, we know from skeletal remains that this planet supports huge, large animals in large quantities. We've had mammals that are 3 times, 4 times the sizes of elephants and rhinos and hippos and things we have today. They were everywhere. We had, flocks of buffalo that would like literally black out an entire valley and provide fertilizer for topsoil. Like, we lived in a different time than we do now, where animals would be a lot more present. Eating fat. So fat's the second energy that we can eat. So we talked about the carbohydrates, how our system runs in glucosis. This is how the body runs in what is called ketosis. This is what happens when you consume fat. Fat will always be fat inside the body. It doesn't change, it remains fat. It gets emulsified, but fat is not water soluble. As you know, if you've ever made salad dressing, doesn't mix very well with vinegar. You have to either blend it or shake it up every time you use it, and even then it can kind of separate out. So fat does not enter directly into the blood because it can't. It can't travel around in water. It's hydrophobic. It's afraid of water. Doesn't like it. So the body has, we talked about these lipoproteins, which is a protein carrier that basically provides a container for fat to go into, and then it can travel around the blood, link up with cells, and provide cells what they need for the moment. When you consume fat, it gets emulsified in the guts, in the small intestine, and then it actually goes through the lymphatic system. After it's packaged up into these packages, this one is a huge package, and it's called chylomicron. Think of this as like the Amazon truck leaving the factory, and it's just filled with a bunch of stuff. All full, it's going to go out, eventually it drops into the bloodstream, and it gets delivered immediately. Within 30 to 60 minutes, these things go from totally full, they get a signal from an HDL cholesterol to open up, the truck opens up and delivers all the packages out to the packages that need it. The cell says, hey, I'd like some energy and I want some fat, great, here's a bunch of fat. Within 30 to 60 minutes, it empties all of its contents, links up with another HDL cholesterol, which gives it a different enzyme, and it goes to the liver to be destroyed. That life is essentially done. And all the while, this big molecule is getting smaller and smaller and smaller until, again, 30 to 60 minutes later, it's gone. When your cells take in this fat energy, it is energy that is to be burned. It is not energy that gets stored in any long-term way. So this goes to cells to be burned and uses energy. It doesn't go to, say, like visceral fat, where most of us store stomach around our midsection. All of that is kind of the life cycle of what happens when the body eats fat. When the body eats protein, it's not an energy source in any appreciable way, so we're not going to talk about it today, but that gets broken down into amino acids, which get reassembled into things we need to build ourselves up with, but it's not an energy source. So again, carbohydrate is a system of glucosis. Eating fat is a system of ketosis, and that's how those two things run. The ketosis system runs without any signal from insulin. Fat has virtually no signal of insulin. Protein has a really slight one, but it doesn't really practically matter. But this system works without the use of any insulin. Insulin remains low. The body takes in the fat that it gets from these chylomicrons and uses it as fuel and burns it. All of this is a very clean and easy system to be able to run. And this is why I argue, again, not just myself, but lots of people argue that this system, rather than being a fad diet that we're seeing, should have been the normal, natural state of human existence for a very, very long time, running the body on fats as an energy source. As it says here, glucose is most people's fuel source. It comes primarily from carbohydrates, and it activates sugar burning. So you're in sugar burning mode when you consume a lot of carbohydrates. Ketones are an alternate fuel source, requires the adequate presence of fat, and also an adequate elimination or reduction of carbohydrates so that you don't trigger insulin, and then puts you in what is called fat burning mode, if you want to think of it that way. So that brings us to the next question: is what are some of the benefits of burning fat versus some of the benefits of burning carbohydrates? What would you think some of the benefits of burning fat are? For example, if we go back up to the graph that we see that the body can only store 2,000 calories from carbohydrates. What might be the benefit of running the body on fat, especially the fat that we store, when we have 100 times more of it?
Well, you can go a lot longer without eating, I would guess.
Yeah, you can go a lot longer. That would be a benefit, for sure. The example I give on this one, if we're looking at the first chart, which shows the blood sugar roller coaster, you are on the roller coaster. If you're feeding your body with glucose, you're always going to be hungry. It's the 30 minutes to an hour, you're going to be very hungry, and so you need to be finding fuel all the time. It's a really good example. I'm taking this from Primal Fat Burner by Nora, I'm going to mess up her last name, Nora Galgetis, like something like that. Anyway, look it up. Basically, she makes the analogy of like running a fire from kindling. you can do that for sure, but you'll have this big smoky
Right.
kind of fire that burns out really quickly. You need to preoccupy yourself with the fire and always be collecting more and more and more kindling that's putting out, again, tons of smoke, flaming up, flaming out, flaming up, flaming out. You have to be obsessed with kindling to be able to keep that fire going. Where fat burning, if we store so many calories of fat on the body, we can use that as a fuel source. That's now like using a log on the fire, so that we don't have to worry so much about needing food all the time. We can go much longer amounts of time without food. If you have a log on the fire, throw the log on, you can leave, you can walk away, come back in a few hours, it might still be burning, you might need to add another log, but you don't have to be obsessed with that over time. For people that want to lose weight, a lot of people tell me they want to lose weight. What they really mean is they want to lose fat. If we have an overabundance of fat, again, 200,000 calories of fat on the body, this person would be pretty high body fat percentage. Odds are pretty good that person would probably feel way better if they got rid of some of that fat. That is a benefit of burning fat for fuel. Other benefits. Being in ketosis provides that water-soluble form of fuel called ketones. There are 3 different ones. And it turns out, as we're learning more and more about this, we're learning that different organs in the body actually prefer ketones as a fuel source when they can get them. Oftentimes, ketones are hoovered up by some of the organs that need constant fuel the most, predominantly the heart. Why have you never heard of heart cancer?
Heart rules.
Why doesn't anybody ever get heart cancer? Isn't that weird?
Yeah.
Heart attacks.
Right.
You get cancer everywhere, but you never hear, there's like single digits of cases where somebody can actually get cancer of the heart. A big reason that they think that the heart in particular, because ketones are a stable fuel source, your body can make them when it's breaking down fat, just maybe at a lower level if you're also eating a ton of carbohydrates, is that any ketones you're making are all taken by the heart preferentially. And since it's such a clean and anti-inflammatory fuel source, maybe that's why we don't get heart cancer. You get cancer in other tissues, but not there. Again, another benefit, the blood sugar roller coaster up and down and up and down and up and down is creating cravings for more of that fuel that's going to give you a quick pick-me-up, a quick boost. When you're using fat, it's a stable fuel that keeps you full for longer, so your cravings go down. Again, you don't need to eat nearly as frequently. Fat reduction we talked about. Another one of the big things, again, we did a whole lesson on insulin resistance. When we are triggering insulin, insulin is the storage hormone that tells the body to store up energy. If that's triggered occasionally, that's not necessarily a bad thing. All hormones should be high and then low depending on what's going on. But it's the constant stimulation of insulin that then causes insulin resistance. Remember, if the cells are already full of energy and they don't want any more, they're going to literally burst at the seams if they get more energy. They will become resistant to the signal of insulin. So your body has to produce more and more and more insulin to have this signal work inside the body. And we know, again, as we talked about with insulin resistance, all of the diseases that associate with insulin resistance, Dr. Ben Bickman writes about this in the book, How We Get Fat, and makes the implication of diabetes, type 2, PCOS, mental disorders like dementia, Alzheimer's, bipolar. We talk about all kinds of different gut issues that people can have, high blood pressure, sexual dysfunction, all kinds of stuff associate themselves with insulin resistance. So when you're running fat as your fuel source, you're not triggering insulin. So insulin sensitivity can stay high inside the body, which means you don't need to overproduce a massive amount of insulin. Just kind of skimming through on some of the benefits of running the body with fat, but suffice it to say, for most people, what's the most relevant today is people have stored up so much fat already, and they want it gone. They want it out. And if we can teach the body to be good at burning fat, they can reduce the amount of fat inside the body in a way that has nothing to do with calories, in a way that doesn't trigger insulin, in a way that keeps people in a really high energetic state. I noticed as I was doing testing on people, metabolic tests, that people that were in this state, their metabolic rates would actually be higher than they normally would be, or that I would expect on average for them. Once the body shifts into its fat burning state and accesses, again, if we're looking at that graph, 200,000 calories of fat, there's no need for the metabolism to decline. It found energy, and the body can say, oh, great, there's so much energy here that was hidden from us when insulin was high, but it's all here. So now we can burn it, and there's a lot of it, so we don't need to have less energy, we can have more energy. The body ramps that up. One way that it does that is by wasting energy. Who has heard of brown fat? Heard of it before?
On that subject, because that was my biggest question this week.
Awesome. Brown fat?
Beige, brown, and white.
Beige, brown, and white fat. White fat is largely inert. Doesn't do. There's a lot that fat tissue does, but it's just kind of what we think of as fat, where it's just the kind of subcutaneous, kind of flabby stuff on the back of our arms that most of us hate and we want gone. That's.
How come they show it as yellow?
It can be kind of yellowish, whatever. It depends.
It's those pictures that here's about.
It's always yellow. Yeah, it's true.
It's great.
Yeah. I imagine it would be about the same color of just the fat you would see on most of the meat that you buy at the store, depending on what's fed. But there is a difference in color depending on how many mitochondria there are in fat cells. So brown fat literally has more mitochondria, so it turns the fat a brownish color. Why don't babies shiver? It's a weird one. Babies don't shiver because they have tons of brown fat. Babies, if they're fed their normal diet, which is breast milk, live in the state of ketosis from the second they're born. They are keto masters in ketosis all the time because they're consuming a high amount of fat and protein from the breast milk. There's also carbohydrate, but they live in a state of ketosis all the time. And part of the reason why they never shiver is because they're born with a very high amount of brown fat. And again, brown fat has more mitochondria, and this is what's called uncoupling of mitochondria. Uncoupling means that the mitochondria is not coupled to energy production, meaning brown fat uses a lot of energy but doesn't make energy as a byproduct. It uses a lot of fuel but doesn't make energy as a byproduct. So I drive a stick shift car. Uncoupled would mean I've got my gas pushed in and I've got my clutch pushed in, both at the same time. I'm not going anywhere, right? The engine's going and it's revving, and importantly, it's getting hot, getting really, really warm. That engine's working really hard. I'm just not moving anywhere. So coupling would be as if I slowly increase the gas and back off the clutch. Now my energy is coupled to me getting somewhere. I'm moving somewhere. Most cells, the mitochondria is coupled and it provides energy from a fuel source. Brown fat is different. It's uncoupled and basically will be that hot revving engine that's going at a really, really high rate.
What's the advantage of that, then?
Creates heat.
Well, so?
Creates heat.
That sounds like a hot flash to me.
Right now.
That sounds like a hot flash to me.
Sounds like a hot flash to you right now when it's supposed to be 103 degrees today outside. But what happens in the wintertime?
Well, that'd be an advantage.
That would be an advantage in the wintertime. And if we think that ketones activate the uncoupling process, and we know that where we store our brown fat is mostly kind of around the neck, the upper chest right in here, if we had excessive amounts of energy that came from fat and we eliminated carbohydrates because it's wintertime and there's none to be had, you could create heat from the fat you stored in the time when you got the carbohydrates. And one of the things that it would do is create heat in that area of the body and thus be a benefit that way. It's also important to know that essentially this is wasting energy. We think it's like this huge waste. But again, if we have people that have a high amount of fat already and they want it gone, this is one way that the body activates that system to get rid of extra energy, which is why I measured people with high metabolic rates when they ate this way. And they always told me, along with that, they were warm. Feel temperature-wise warm all the time, even in the wintertime. Hands and feet are warm. The opposite of that would be typically a female who would over-diet, who it could be 100 degrees outside and they're always cold. Chronically cold because they've crushed their metabolic rate from doing too many diets, not eating enough calories, and doing too much exercise, as we talked about in one of the very first episodes that we did. That brings the metabolic rate down. It limits the brown fat activation because that's wasting energy. The body's trying to conserve energy as hard as it can, so that's a process it's not going to go with. Thus, we see people with lower body temperatures in that state. Insulin itself will turn down brown fat activation. Ketones do the opposite and signal brown fat activation to increase. Again, looks like this kind of a waste of energy, but it's actually a use of extra fuel in the form of heat in that way. So kind of cool. Do you have any other brown fat questions?
No, I can't remember what I ran across, but the article or something was basically going on about 3 different types of fat, but I didn't get deep enough into it to know. Well, I was kind of like, so what? You know, what I got mostly out of it is that each of those colors of fat molecules are different sizes. White being the biggest, beige being the middle, and brown being the smallest. And I was like, okay, so what? And that's where I
got it.
Had to do something else.
Yep.
And so I'm like, okay, so what?
The brownness comes from the extra mitochondria that is not, it's taking in energy in the form of fat, but it's burning it off as fat, and so it's getting rid of it essentially, and that's why they stay smaller versus a normal fat cell can get bigger and bigger and store more until it reaches the point where it doesn't want to store more and becomes insulin resistant at that level, okay. Essentially.
And what's beige doing?
Beige, you can quote unquote beige your fat cells if you eat in a certain way. Remember, ketones activate this process. Being in glucosis is the antithesis to this process. Doesn't want you wasting energy in that state. Insulin shuts it down. Ketosis increases it. Again, if you think of like, you know, we have winters. We don't eat seasonally anymore. But if we were eating seasonally, there would be a time in the year that we would have carbohydrates and a time in the year that we would have less carbohydrates. Okay. And so you would need to switch your different fuel sources depending on what the state is. When we've been talking about all these different, different lessons and what we've done with food, and we talked about grains and the refinement of sugar and seed oils, we are now living on a diet that would not have been possible 100, 200, 500 years ago to the extent that it is today, where you can live in glucosis all the time and never get into ketosis. People do that. They wake up, they start eating. It's high carbohydrate foods. They can stay in that state the whole time. But again, they're running an emergency system. One nice way to know whether you are already good at burning fat versus whether you're a carbohydrate burner is you can ask yourself a series of very simple questions. So one of the questions might be, when I get hungry, do I get hangry? Does hunger feel like, for me, like I've gone, what is it now? 19 hours without any food. I feel in my stomach, I feel a little hungry. That's it. My mood isn't low. Hopefully I'm not horrible to be with. You guys can maybe disagree with me. My brain doesn't change. My energy doesn't really change. Like I feel like an emptiness in my stomach is what I feel. If you feel like you get hangry, a word that is now an official word, it's actually in our dictionary as of like 2018 or 19, which tells you, I want to kill somebody when I get hungry. I turn into this gremlin that nobody likes to be around. Moody, pissy, you're only focused on that one thing. I'll give you a great example of one of my podcast guests described this as hunger for him always used to be a bully. So it didn't matter what he was doing, if he was working, if he was with his family, if he was on vacation, the bully would come into his life, shove him down, and say, you need to pay attention to me right now. Where's your milk money? It would be a bully. And when he learned that when he changed his eating, the bully had transformed into hunger being a really good friend. Where same situations, he could be on vacation or working, but he'd feel a gentle tap on the shoulder and be like, hey buddy, I'm your friend Hunger. How are you? What are you doing? Like, can we eat? Do you want to eat right now? No. Oh, I see you're busy. Okay, you're busy. I'll come back later. I'll go play on the playground and I'll come back. And that's the way he described it. His bully became like a really nice friend that would just be very cordial and polite and would not crash whatever he was doing. It would just be like, hey, hungry. You want to eat? No? All right, we'll come back. We'll do it later. It's totally fine. So one question you can ask, when I get hungry, do I get hangry? If the answer is yes, you probably are a carbohydrate dominant burning person. If you answer no, you're probably very good at burning fat. Do you need snacks between meals? If you answered yes, you're probably more on the side of burning sugar. versus burning fat. You probably don't. Another one would be, I just said snacking. Do you wake up and the first meal of your day, does that contain a high amount of carbohydrate? Especially in the first meal, that's a good way to know um, whether you are burning sugar or burning fat. Those would be just some really simple questions that you could ask you.
That's a hard one to answer in this culture because we're pushed so much with muffins, cereals, carbs as the breakfast food.
Yep.
And taking the time to whip up some eggs and stuff that's high protein takes more time.
It does.
You can cram the carbs in your mouth in less than 5 minutes.
Yep.
It takes.
You can go to Starbucks and get a drink.
Yep.
Full of sugar and
it'll be pure
Yep.
glucose.
I can't drink that stuff anymore. I went a couple of weeks ago with a girlfriend from high school, and I was like, I was a supervisor at Starbucks, and on those, when I'd open the store or those early mornings, I'd have to toss back an upside down doppio, which was just an espresso shot with whipped cream on the bottom. No sugar, no syrup, no nothing. And that would get me going and get me the jump starter that I need. But I cannot take all that syrup they pump into.
Oh yeah, pump. I know.
All that shit.
These are all related to, again, the seminar that we did about how we refine sugar, the refinement of grains, and creating seed oils as the most toxic things. Those all keep foods extremely shelf stable so that you can prepare them and they will stay good for a really, really long time. They then become the convenience foods. It is way easier to grab a muffin on your way out of the door than it is
Pop-Tarts.
They're way easier. They're delicious. They have been made with the sugar and with the grains. We love them, and our body is programmed to love them, and that's not something you'll ever get over. Unfortunately, you and I talk about it all the time because your body has to make you be rewarded for finding carbohydrate in nature because it is exceedingly rare. Even, again, we talked about this, but like if grains, for example, we only started agriculture and raising grains, domesticating grains like 10,000 years ago. That required crazy amounts of backbreaking labor. It required us to modify the plants to have more yield. It required that we got at some of that energy. So you had to soak the grains, you had to crush the grains, you didn't just have like Wonder Bread from white flour. Like, you have to go through crazy processes to make these foods available to you. Now we can do that. Throughout our evolution, we could not have done that. Would have been absolutely impossible to be able to do. So yes, now we live in a world where it's way more convenient to find some of these foods that are shelf stable. They stay good. They're commodities. They're around everywhere. They're very inexpensive. You can eat them all day, every day, and have the acute emergencies and not have the chronic emergencies appear until it's been a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades down the road of running an emergency system all the time. Going back to the talk that we did about insulin resistance, we've already kind of mentioned this today, but do you recall some of the most egregious kind of chronic diseases that you can develop when your body becomes insulin resistant from running the glucosis system all the time? Again, we just mentioned a bunch of them, but
Well, the thing that sticks out so much in my mind, and I don't know if it's neuropathic damage or whatever, but those people that I had on my paratransit bus when I was working those 8 years at UTA, and I'd see them be literally sawed piece by piece to death because they were rotting, for lack of a better term, from the diabetes and stuff like that. I was just like going, excuse me, but I was just like, this is hideous.
Yeah. And
yet they would be sharing with me that we're having this strawberry shortcake this weekend, this barbecue with all this, sugar sauces on it and stuff like that, and all these things that they love and miss and want and still want. Like you were saying, it gets in their system, and they were literally going to their graves being sawed apart by that.
Was it obvious to you? Like, could you see what was going on, or was it only later that you, like, or were you like, oh, these guys are, it's diet related and it's a lot of sugar?
Yeah, I mean, it was amazing to me how many of those people were so preoccupied with what you just said a few minutes ago about how it becomes something that you can't get away from. It's like this crazy addiction because they would be talking about food in the good old days as like they were a heroin addict.
Yeah.
And still wanting it. And I'd just be like, God, do you see that you're losing an eye? You've lost your leg. You've lost your foot. You know.
A heroin addict needs another hit.
Yeah.
I've had 3 people where they become so obese and they can hardly move, but they get from the knee down infected.
Yep.
And both legs are wrapped and they just ooze away.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's pretty bad. The necrosis you can get from that kind of thing is pretty bad. You see it in people's lower limbs all the time. If you see that the discoloration and darkness, you know that's already happening to some extent. It happens in extremities.
And I can honestly say that that it's as grotesque in its presentation as it is when you see someone who's necrotic from drug abuse.
Yeah.
And it's coming from sugar and food. Yep. And so I'm just like going, it always just blew me away. And thank God my mother never got that bad. But, you know, like we talked about in past sessions, you know, before they got it solved, it did enough damage that she was miserable the rest of her life. And so it's kind of like, holy crap.
Yep. Yeah, no, it's really sad. And that's where we need to decide, just because something appears in our food, because we have vegetable oil in our food, is that food? Just because we have sugar in our food, does that make it not a chemical and not a toxin and not something else? It's so ubiquitous, we just think of it as food when really it probably should be more known as a toxin, essentially.
I did an interesting experiment in the last few weeks. I bought an $8 bottle of organic chocolate milk, not very low process. Graduated experiment here. Whole milk, nothing but whole milk and organic. You can take that for what you want. Organic's a useless term, but still, that's the way they were marketing it. Anyway, but very simple compared to the Dairy Gold carton milk that is highly processed. Oh my God! Even in Sugarland, the difference between whole milk, non-processed, chemical milk, and that. I was like, man, if I ever buy chocolate milk again, it's going to be this $8 bottle.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep.
And I'm like, if you're going to diet sim, folks, this is where you want to do it.
Yeah.
Not on this Dairy Gold shit.
Yeah.
Get the Strauss's whole milk.
Nice.
That's not highly processed and stuff like that.
Huge difference.
So I was like, but what the only thing that taught me is that, okay, if I'm going to do, like I say, this diet sending, I'll call it, then I want to do it with the highest quality stuff.
Cool. Yeah.
It's a graduated step that way.
Yep.
And I'm willing to commit when I'm going to do chocolate milk that I will do it in that form.
Cool. Yeah, great.
But the interesting thing is that I find that the more I get exposed to real foods, the less I can tolerate the process.
Yeah, you taste it more. The processed crap tastes like chemicals.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's what sugar does. To briefly just talk about this quote unquote method. This was, again, I'm arguing that this is our normal natural state through evolution. The 300,000 years that we've been human sapien, and probably going back to the 6,000 years that we've been hominid species, I believe a lot of that and part of our brain growth and everything and all the steps of our evolution was our natural and normal state. As a formal thing, this was really discovered in the 1920s as a pretty decent cure for seizures. It was they found out, they've known this for centuries actually. In ancient Rome, if you had seizures, they would like stick you in a cave with no food for a few days and come and get you and you'd be fine. Like you'd cure yourself basically doing a 3 or 4 day long intermittent fast or whatever. So they know that it helped the brain, but this was in particular a good treatment that they discovered for kids, especially with epilepsy and having seizures. That was identified in the 1920s, something that was used in favor until about the 1950s when pharmaceutical drugs were developed for epilepsy. So changing the diet fell out of favor. Same with diabetes. It's been known for 100 years that if you reduce the carbohydrate, you reduce the insulin. In the 1920s, we started making insulin. So the question became, why are we putting people on carbohydrate restrictive diets? They can't eat like everybody else. Why don't we just let them eat like everybody else, and then we'll give them insulin, which will then bring their blood sugar down? We did that before learning, like, oh, this is why we shouldn't give somebody insulin, this much insulin for this long, as we create other problems. Pharma, again, kind of pushed, this type of treatment to the back burner, so nobody really knew about it. Different steps in the last 20, 30, 40 years, like Dr. Robert Atkins, promoted the Atkins diet, which was a ketogenic diet for weight loss. We know that there was a director, Abrams, who directed Airplane. His last name is Abrams.
Oh, I don't know.
Anyway, John Abrams, I think his name. His son started getting seizures, epileptic seizures, and he had the means. He did everything he possibly could to fix the seizures. Finally found that at Johns Hopkins, they used a ketogenic diet for kids with epilepsy, and it blew his mind. He even made a documentary or a movie about it later with Sharon Stone. I can't remember. Anyway, and started a foundation called the Charlie Foundation, which is the name of his son. Basically cured himself on epilepsy. So this diet has been around. It's been used. Again, today we're not talking about the keto diet and what that means, but being in ketosis. Let's talk about some of the other implications of some of these chronic diseases. We're going to start with, so this is on the backside where it says ketogenic research. We're going to start with type 2 diabetes. This is the first graph you're going to see here is a company called Virta. The Virta treatment, clinically proven type 2 diabetes reversal after 1 year. Basically putting patients who were type 2 diabetic on a diet that was largely devoid of carbohydrates, had a decent amount of fat and a certain amount of protein. 60% of patients reverse their type 2 diabetes. A little bit controversial saying the word reverse, but essentially if you're not taking medications and you're not showing symptoms of type 2 diabetes, are you diabetic or not? They found out essentially that these people really didn't qualify as long as they ate a certain diet. 60%. If you had a drug that had a 60% chance of improving something, that would be an all-star blockbuster drug. Amazing. 94% of people reduced or eliminated their usage of insulin, and the drop that people experienced after 1 year is a 1.3 average HbA1c reduction, which is how we measure and diagnose type 2 diabetes. So we found that eating in this certain way and being in ketosis can reverse type 2 diabetes. Amazing stuff. What have we learned about dementia, Alzheimer's, that kind of thing? There's a reason we call Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. It's because the brain becomes insulin resistant and its only fuels are going to be carbohydrates or ketones as an alternate fuel. The brain loves ketones, and if it has them, it looks like it prefers them and can burn up to 80% of what it needs in a day from ketones and ketone bodies. There's some really fantastic research that was done in the 1960s with fasting that showed us that. Anyway, in the brain with Alzheimer's and the demented mind, the brain is awash in sugar, but because it has become insulin resistant, it can't use that fuel anymore. So the brain is starving even though it's surrounded with fuel because of the insulin resistance. Oh, wow. So I have talked to people personally who were classified as having moderate to more advanced stages of Alzheimer's dementia, unable to carry on conversations, unable to remember things, missing out facts, who have reversed their disease and have left facilities that deal with that kind of thing because they put their brain in a state of ketosis, gave it a different fuel, and all of a sudden the brain came back to life, essentially. Wow. Pretty amazing research we're doing there. It's really interesting to see. I've never seen this before, but just in this last month, there was a study ongoing. I can't remember the school that was doing it. I reached out to the person running the trial to see if I could interview her to get the lowdown on this. Even she's confused why this happened, but they've completely shut down the study in the middle of it and have not provided a clear reason. This person is kind of heartbroken and is very confused why this study was not allowed to go on. Blood pressure, something that easily drops out when you drop the carbohydrates, you drop the insulin, blood pressure will go back to a normal level very, very quickly. People need to be very careful about their medications when they're at the state. Another one that I wanted to bring up, this is again very, very high level. You'll get a lot more resources and all the references provided. Another one that I wanted to bring up was cancer. We've known since the 1920s that cancer cells revert to an ancient form of metabolism called fermentation. Bacteria ferment. The first kind of living creatures on this planet had a very inefficient type of metabolism, which is fermentation, but that's how they got their energy. Later on, we learned how to do what's called respiration, which is essentially breathe and take in oxygen and use that as an energy production, which is way more efficient. We made way more, kind of a lot more energy, and thus, we're more complicated today than bacteria were back in the day. In the 1920s, a German researcher was studying cancer metabolism and discovered that even in the presence of oxygen, cancer cells would revert to this ancient form of metabolism called fermentation, and they would mutate and grow and proliferate more so than was good for the cancer, meaning the cancer would just continue to spread and spread and spread until it accomplished its mission by spreading, but then it would kill itself because it got too big. Most tissues in your body know what size they need to get to, and they stop growing at a certain point. So it's why even consuming tons of carbohydrates and insulin, your brain doesn't just continue growing and growing and growing. Your liver can get bigger and enlarged, but it doesn't keep growing and growing and growing forever. Cancer cells don't do that. They continue growing and growing. And he noticed, anyway, this guy is named Otto Warburg, noticed that even in the presence of oxygen, cancer cells would prefer carbohydrate, glucose, as a fuel source. So the hypothesis was take away the fuel source, starve the cancer cell, and now it doesn't have a fuel. Sure enough, his research was able to confirm that if you took away glucose, cancer cells would not proliferate because they would have no fuel. They'd have a lot less. Cancer cells do require glucose and glutamine. So glutamine is another fuel for cancer. But essentially, if you limited the glucose, you could have cancer cells that would stop proliferating, and you'd have tumors that could actually even shrink. This research was so important that during the World War II and during the Nazi regime, they kept Otto Warburg in Germany, even though he was very likely homosexual and he was a Jew openly. They still kept him in Germany during this time because cancer was a really big pet project for Adolf Hitler. His mom passed away of cancer, and it's something that he was really, really, really into. They kept Otto Warburg in the country during the Second World War and protected him. That's how important this research was. Wow. We then discovered DNA in the 1950s, and we started down this path of saying that cancer is a genetic disease. We did the genetic sequencing, trying to find where cancer mutations would happen, and we found out actually they're kind of a mess. And you could have two people with the exact same cancer that would have completely different cancers, essentially. Even though they were the same, they could come from different genes. It's just, all of the research that we've done, and millions and millions and millions and billions of dollars, and all the 5Ks we've ever run for cancer awareness and research has really led us nowhere in cancer. Tons of people die every single day of cancer, just like they did before. Right. We've not gone anywhere with that.
Richard Nixon. I'm going to be the president that cures cancer.
1,600 Americans a day die of cancer.
1968, 72.
Here we are. Nothing's gotten better. We talked about how heart disease never got any better. It's the only reason we changed our diet to begin with. But we lost this wisdom of cancer as a metabolic disease. And now there's researchers out there who are saying, wait a second, this research has been done. Why don't we starve cancer cells? Why don't we just take away glucose and let's find ways to limit glutamine and see if we can just starve out cancer. And since ketones are an alternate fuel to the body that the body seems to love, it's a two-way thing that has benefit in both ways. You have cancer cells that can't thrive without the glucose, and the rest of your tissues love ketones as a fuel source. So it's beneficial in both ways. Not only has that research been done, but again, I have talked to several people, several case studies of people that should have been dead, were given diagnoses of things like glioblastoma, which is a 6 to 12 month diagnosis of you're going to die in 6 to 12 months. I personally talked to somebody who's been alive 10 years with a tumor in his brain, and he has not died because he from that day was on a very low glucose ketogenic diet. Spoken with him. He's a happy guy. He lives with his kids and his wife.
Did the tumor die or go away, or is it still in place?
Shrank. I know it shrank to the point that he was able to, I think at least one was able to extract a lot safer. I've also heard that story a lot of times. Like we do a lot of needle biopsies, which is poking a cancer cell,
Right.
which may or may not end up being a great idea
Right.
if you think about poking
Right.
things that could then like move around in the body. But what if somebody were to go on a certain diet that was limiting the glucose inside the body, and you could have a tumor that would then shrink? Could you then surgically go in, operate, get this smaller tumor out, and potentially not need more dangerous forms of cancer treatment, which is chemotherapy and radiation?
Well, the interesting thing is, my dad did not. My dad beat prostate cancer without chemo, cutting, or seeding. But he didn't go ketones, as far as I know. He went Rotarian, like we talked about. But did they back away from the sugar? Whole foods, fiber, all that stuff. He lived to 91.
Yep.
He was diagnosed at 65.
Yep.
He never had any of the traditional forms of treatment.
Great point. Just like we said, you can do this vegan, you can do this vegetarian, you can do this on a mixed diet, you can do this on an all animal food diet. It's just about limiting sugar. If you ate fiber, you're not absorbing any of that carbohydrate, even though it's a carbohydrate. Absolutely.
When they returned to sugar, because when they got into their late 80s, my mom and dad both said, screw it, we're clearly going to be going out fairly soon, so we are occasional. But they would get that gelato, but they would limit themselves to a scoop that size.
Yeah.
They had that little thing, and it would go in this little demi cup or whatever you want to call it. But they, that was enough.
That's where you got your moderating power from.
I got my 44.
Yeah. I was going to say, you need a bigger tub.
Well, yeah. And so, granted, I will admit that, yeah, that's a congenital thing, and my dad's sense of discipline was just insane. But the point is, he also was willing to admit. It became ambiguous to him, though, before he died. I'm not sure I even had cancer.
Yeah.
He wondered if the diagnosis was incorrect, because for men over 50, the enlarged, prostate and that whole skit, not being able to pee and too often during the night and stuff like that seems to be, it's an epidemic. And so, the things that they're using to diagnose prostate cancer and stuff like that, sometimes those anyway, whatever you call them, tests can be triggered by, I don't know what, but it has me just sitting here wondering if even that.
When I interviewed one of these researchers that is doing some of this research on metabolic therapies, is one of my favorite people to talk to. His name is Dr. Thomas Seyfried. He's at Boston University, either Boston College or Boston University. What's that?
Seyfried?
Yeah, Seyfried. Okay. Thomas Seyfried. When I get to talk to him, he's one of the pioneers in discovering that cancer is a metabolic disease. Right. It runs on carbohydrate. One of the most chilling things that he told me was that cancer is a revenue-creating disease.
Right.
If you really let that sink in, then you realize that, we're in a predicament because hospitals need to do some of these treatments that are not that great for people. I had a front row seat to this when I was a teenager. My mom, at age 39, was diagnosed with breast cancer. I was 13 or 14 at the time. She had mastectomy, then did chemo, then did radiation. We changed our diets. So we went low fat as we could. So in came skim milk, more of like the snack wells kind of stuff was there. Sugar was fine. We always had a homemade dessert or, red vines or fruit snacks were always around, tons of cereal. The cancer went away for a few years, then it came back, and when it came back in her bones. So she had to do a low-level chemo for 2 or 3 years. like a once every other week kind of thing.
Oh, God.
I went to Brazil on my mission. They called me after I'd been there about 3 or 4 months and said that I needed to live where the office was because my mom was just given 3 months to live, and I needed to call home every week to see if I needed to go home and be with her. The cancer had spread to her brain and all over different organs. She ended up living another few years. By the time it was getting to the end, she'd already maxed out the amount of radiation a human could have, so that was no longer on the table. The cancer, the chemotherapy, it's so hard on the body. She just like wasted away. And yeah.
Was she pretty sentient during that last phase, or did it also affect her thinking?
Only until the very, very last. Like the last week or so, I remember her sister would come over to like record her like autobiography and like give her family history, and like it was a struggle for her to get through it. And I remember she may have like forgotten stuff. So whether that was just like, I think it was just starting hospice care and maybe like morphine was just starting or something. That may have been part of it. But yeah, luckily for the most part, her brain was still there. But I mean, she was on huge doses of Oxycontin at the time and crazy pain. Again, the radiation treatments, the chemotherapy in particular, would just, it'd be terrible. And just thinking back on like, I wondered, knowing this now, again, I've talked to people who have done chemo, chosen to do chemotherapy for their cancer, but they incorporated things like fasting, or they took ketone supplements, and they describe fasting 48 hours before, do a treatment, fast 24 hours afterwards. They don't get sick, or the treatments work and don't seem to go away. They don't feel crappy. They are up and out and about and moving. That was not the experience that I had with cancer, where like you have a treatment and you are down for the count for days. I knew that like when the bedroom doors were shut, it's like, okay, dinner's on my own today. I got to figure out what to eat because mom's not around to do it, because she'd be so dead. So she finally passed in 2006. But you just wonder like how many people have to suffer like that because they don't know this information. And that gets onto kind of this like last point of like, isn't ketosis dangerous? There is literally billions of dollars done in research every single year. Pharmaceutical companies, food industries pay for this kind of funding, and none of it will ever be done on this state of energy, right? This state of being, this energy delivery system, ketosis. The funding that does get done, it is one of the highest studied kind of states and ways of being that's out there. You can Google search and find on PubMed lots of studies that are done, but they're not funded by the big pharma companies. They're normally generally very small. Or this is also the reason why on your 9 p.m. nightly news, every few months, you'll see a new study says that a keto diet is likely to cause a greater chance of heart disease or whatever. And then you read the studies and you see that, they're not talking about ketosis. They're talking about a quote-unquote keto-like diet where they're eating more fat than somebody else might be eating, but based on the macronutrients, it looks like they're eating hamburgers with a bun and sugary ketchup and having a soda. And you look at the studies and it's like the difference is minuscule, or it's done by a small amount of people, or it's done by food frequency questionnaires. And all you'll hear forever about this is that it's bad for you. It's not going to work. You're going to die. And all these headlines influence what people eat. And they see people that maybe try this diet and have improved and they lose weight and they feel really good. But they also know that they're going to die of heart disease. Or they see these headlines that are so misleading. And I just want to point out that however you decide to eat, don't expect for any of that to change, because literally, and Dave does a great job talking about this, multi-trillion-dollar industries. As of the writing of this book, we were spending 3.8, I want to say, $billion in medical expense. He assumes, based on his calculations, if 80% of the people does what he recommends in this book, which is eat mostly fats and proteins, spend some of your life temporarily, seasonally, or all the time in ketosis, you would probably reduce the medical system cost by about 80%. And that would reduce 80% of $3.8 trillion goes to $800 billion. That's a huge, huge difference. And so you have to expect that the industries, the pharmaceutical industry, the medical industry, the food companies, they can't have you know this. Even the BS keto products, keto slim fast, you see, like they're still trying to sell you something when all you need to do for most people is just don't worry about eating fats and proteins and eat whole real foods. But again, that's why this will never be mainstream. It's never going to be a thing that's talked about and promoted. It's never going to be studied in the way that some of these other pharmaceutical agents are studied, because those generate revenue and this does not. If you want to try this, you definitely can. All you have to do is take your carbohydrates sufficiently low enough to where your body is in a ketogenic state, which just means it's burning fat as fuel. You can eat lots of fat. So, great question. The cool thing about a ketogenic diet is the answer to that question is, do you have a certain excess of ketones in your body? That's it. If you have ketones in your body, an excess of them in a certain amount, then you know you're on a ketogenic diet. That's simply all that it means. It doesn't have anything to do with what you ate to get there.
Well, how does a person that doesn't have a keto, like the diabetes strips? I don't have keto strips. I mean, I don't want to do that any more than I want to track my blood sugar.
So great question. So you would be in the category where I am, where I say, like, am I in ketosis or not? I don't know.
Okay.
I assume that I am.
Okay.
Because I don't eat carbohydrates.
Right.
But I don't know. I have no way of validating that because I'm not measuring.
Right.
So if you want to know, then you would buy a blood meter, which now you're sticking yourself.
Right.
You would buy a breath meter, which more of those are coming onto the market, where you can blow into something and it will measure one of the ketones, which is called acetone.
Right.
Or you can buy pee strips, which are very non-invasive, but will work less and less and less the more you're on the diet, because your body will be producing less ketones and your body will be using more ketones.
Okay.
And that just shows the ketones, acetoacetate, that you're wasting through urine. So in the beginning, your body makes a ton of ketones, it has nothing to do with them, so it just wastes and gets rid of them. Over time, it makes less of them and then uses more of them, so that equalizes a bit.
Okay.
So if the question is, how do I know? The answer is you have to validate it with one of those three methods: blood, breath, or urine.
Okay.
If you don't want to know, you could ask yourself the same questions that we asked earlier. When you get hungry, do you get hangry, or do you feel a little rumble in your stomach and that's kind of it? Chances are you're burning fat in that state, and chances are if you're burning fat, you're probably producing an excess of ketones, you're probably in a ketogenic state. If you can do intermittent fasting very easily and not be a gremlin in a day, that's another sign you're probably there. Physical symptoms would be, there's a certain mouthfeel that I'll describe as kind of tannic, like tannins in a grape skin. So if you think about chewing just the skin of a grape, you're not kind of like dryish. Acetone is what comes out of the breath when you're in a ketogenic state. So you might notice your breath smells a little bit fruity, or you have that kind of mouthfeel of like kind of dry, like acetone.
Right.
That would be a sign.
Okay.
Again, the hunger to me is kind of the biggest thing. Can you skip snacks? Can you not need naps every day? Can you go and eat 1 or 2 meals a day and be fine? That to me is a good sign that you're, again, burning fat, and by proxy of that, you are making ketones. Other proxies would be looking at the ratio. You could look at your blood sugar. So if you have elevated blood sugar, you're probably not. A1C is the measurement of blood sugar over a period of about 3 or 4 months. That could maybe tell you that, again, requires blood work.
Right.
You could also look at your triglyceride to HDL ratio. So HDL is the type of cholesterol you want to be high.
Right.
Triglycerides are the fat that's created by the liver when you're in glucosis. So you want that to be low. If you're consuming a bunch of carbohydrates, your HDL is going to be low. Your triglycerides are going to be very high because you're using that system all the time and making tons of triglycerides. So if you have low triglycerides and high HDL, very simple marker to know you're probably in a fat burning state or in ketosis more of the time. That's a really easy one. That requires a very simple blood test. It's very inexpensive that you can do. We used to do them at a gym and they would cost like $30. Like easy. The hunger
I know
again
one
is, I
has
think,
a
the
blood
biggest thing.
test where the HDL and triglyceride thing, it said that I was a tad on the high side of that ratio. What was that?
If you find the numbers, send them, and like, we can put them into a calculator, and I can show you.
Okay.
Different people want the ratio at different things, but yeah, that would be one thing to look at. That would very easily tell you as a proxy. I think overall, how is your metabolic health? That's a really easy one.
I don't know. You know, the thing that I have trouble, I mean, I'm sitting here listening to you describe that and stuff. I'm like, going, well, I can go 18, 19 hours, eat once a day, all the time.
Cool.
I honestly can. But guess what? You know what? I don't always feel the greatest. And like we've talked about before, people are always, my own doctors, you're fine, lad. That 18% body fat's fine. You're. I'm like, I don't feel I feel too thick through the middle. I get on that body composition scale. It says I am too thick through the middle on my visceral fat.
Yep.
Every kind of fat except the visceral fat is fine. And in the green, the visceral fat's in the orange.
Yep.
No matter what I do, it stays stuck at that 11.3, whatever it is.
Yep.
I can't remember, pounds or grams, or not grams, but whatever it is. And I'm like going, well, crap, that just doesn't budge no matter what I seem to do. And so then I'm like going, well, is this not even frigging diet related? And is it all medication related? And so then, I'm listening to this, and I think obviously we've had these discussions. So granted, I think it's very important, but at the same time, I'm kind of like going, man, maybe I'm just shaking the wrong tree.
Maybe. Now, again, keep in mind that these are just the two ways of doing glucosis and ketosis, the way we described. The main goal for a lot of people, I would say, is what is called metabolic flexibility, where you can bounce between the two whenever you want.
Right.
I have carbohydrates. I burn carbohydrates. I'm in glucosis. I don't have carbohydrates. I eat fats and proteins. I'm in ketosis, and you go back and forth. A lot of people can do that. Really? You don't have to be in. Yeah, these are just two energy systems. And
because I get the kindling analogy you use, I was like going, yeah, it does. But I also get the, like I say, when I can get focused on something and go, okay, I am not bothering with cooking and all this shit today. And I can eat one meal, go to bed, I get up the next day.
Yep.
I'm not hangry.
Yep, a normal human should be able to bounce between those two things and those two states. That's totally normal. What's that? If you run both, you have the insulin signal and glucose runs. These two systems will run when fat goes and when carbohydrates go. So we describe them as two kind of separate, but
you can't run ethanol with the ethanol free.
Yeah. So like the way most people eat is you're eating fat and carbohydrates together. So maybe both systems are kind of running. You're delivering fat through the chylomicrons, through the lymphatic energy system. You can also at the same time be running carbohydrates through the liver in the hepatic system and have both. Unfortunately, the insulin signal wants to store everything. So you're probably in that state, not only storing an excessive amount of carbohydrates, but also storing an excessive amount of the fat that's also circulating around. So good question. If you want to look it up, it's something called the Randall cycle. And the best way I've heard this described is when you're eating carbs and fats together, it's like having two obese people trying to fit in through the same revolving door and both can't fit at the same time.
Guess what happens when I eat a meal like that? It does not stay in me.
Yeah.
I don't mean to be too graphic, but I'm like going, it's not vomiting and it's
digestive issues.
Yeah. And I'm just like, well, crap, what's going on? And I'm like going, I'm following Bickman's thing. Don't fear fats. Prioritize proteins, I'm putting that eggs and stuff like that. Now, do I have to admit that I stuck a piece of that cinnamon chip toast in there with butter on it?
There you
and chased it with some orange juice?
Yep.
Oh, shit.
Yep.
Is that what's going on?
That has an effect. You would not ever find that in nature. It's just the only thing. We can combine fats and carbohydrates today. You only find that in dairy products in nature. You don't find carbohydrate and fat together. So it just, for our metabolism, it doesn't do great. There's a season when you can run primarily in glucosis, Call it fruit season,
Right.
end of summer. Eat all the fruit you want. What's that?
Watermelon.
It's watermelon
Peak
season. Exactly.
Yes.
Have all of them. Eat all the watermelon you want. As long as you do it seasonally and just know, okay, now there's a greater part of the year where you're in ketosis. Now there's no more fruit. You have to live on your body fat. That's normal. That should be the normal human state. We shouldn't even have to be having this conversation. It's just that we made sugar and grains very available. So now we're never in a winter state. It's always summer as far as our bodies know. And that's the trick. So again, people can decide. Some people like me find that it's actually easier to stay in this state. I kind of just, it's convenient. I like it. I like the food.
Is Bethany eating that way?
Mostly, yeah. She can tolerate.
See, that's part of the bugaboo. When you live with someone who carboholic,
Makes it harder.
then it makes it really hard.
It makes it harder for sure.
And so that's why when you kind of piqued my curiosity when you were talking about that Randall, what is it, Randall?
Randall cycle.
Randall cycle, because I'm like going, well, because I'm kind of forced into that anyway.
Yeah.
And so
again, it's not easy because you live in a world where you can do that, and it's delicious. Pizza is delicious. Right. Burritos are delicious. Like right. you live in a place where you can do that, where that wouldn't be possible before.
Right.
So you have to decide. Again, it's kind of one of my favorite phrases: when pain increases, hearing improves.
Right.
I avoid all carbohydrate because if I eat a bunch, then I feel my sugar cravings come on. I feel like I'm an addict and I want more, and then my anxiety comes back.
Yeah.
For me, it's enough for me personally where I say I don't want to deal with that.
Right.
I'm okay to not deal with that. But other people, my lifestyle would be way too strict and rigid and nonsense for them to live, and they might absolutely rather have a bit of anxiety and deal with it. I just found that I was not able to.
Right.
My friends who have bipolar, they have to be strict. They can't deviate. It's not, they can't just switch in and out of this state. It's like you do this or you're bipolar. Right. Which one do you choose? It's not fun, but they do it because the penalty for not is so severe. Right. But again, if you have metabolic flexibility, you can burn carbohydrates, you limit them, you can burn fat, you limit them. That's different than just like, I'm only going to live in glucosis and only carbohydrates all the time and see how that breaks down that emergency system that you're running and throttling just all the time. So again, a few things to think about, but that kind of wraps today. We only have a few more of these. I cannot believe we've done 10. We only have 4 or 5 left. The topics we still have are monster topics. And we're just skimming the surface. But we'll be talking about food addiction. We'll be talking about safe ways to detoxify plants so they can be much safer for us. We can consume them better. We're going to do a whole thing on mental health. We're actually going to have a guest speaker. The husband of this friend of mine who is bipolar is going to be in town. So we get to talk to him what his experience is like living with somebody who was bipolar and is now not. He himself has lost 100 pounds. He's just a cool guy. So we'll get to talk to him. And then we'll also do one that's all about like lifestyle stuff. So how do you take this and apply this? What other things are important for health, sleep, stress, workouts, strength training, all that stuff. We'll cover all that. We'll cover fasting, that kind of stuff. But only a few more.